Welcome to the Solomon Success Show, where we explore the timeless wisdom of King Solomon and the Bible as it relates to business and investing. False prophets and get-rich-quick schemes are everywhere. Let's not be distracted by these. Instead, let's go to the source, the eternal principles that create a life of peace, power, and prosperity. Here's our host, Jason Hartman.
It's my pleasure to welcome Lawrence W. Reed. He is the former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, former president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, editor of the best-selling book, Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism, the author of a pamphlet entitled Great Myths of the Great Depression. Maybe we should talk about that one a little bit today, too. I think it's fitting for the times. But the new book, Was Jesus A Socialist? Why this question is being asked again and why the answer is almost always wrong. Lawrence, welcome. How are you?
Hey, just terrific, Jason. Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.
It's good to have you. Good to have you. So, socialism. What is socialism? I think there's quite a bit of confusion about this this word that is thrown around quite a bit, right?
Oh, that's right. There's even confusion among socialists themselves. There was a time, decades ago, when it was pretty exclusively thought to mean government ownership of the means of production. But everywhere that was tried, particularly in the communist world, it proved to be such a flop that even many socialists said, well, we don't quite mean that. Let's focus on something else. And so sometimes by socialism, they mean a welfare state. Other times they mean central planning of the economy by a handful of elites, or some combination thereof. But whatever definition you employ, it all comes down to a single word, and that is force, the use of force. Socialism in every variety is not a list of recommendations or suggestions for the comment box. They are proposals to mandate or impose rules and regulations and sky-high taxes on other people. And the motivations, of course, do vary. Some people just like the government in charge and don't care much about what the outcome is. Others think that government is the best way to deal with things like poverty. So many times socialists are very well-meaning, but they are woefully in error when they suggest that it's either a workable system or a productive system or one that Jesus Christ would have somehow supported.
Yeah, so the distinction between socialism and communism, though. Socialism is not ownership of the means of production per se. That would be communism. Socialism would be sort of the less ugly little brother of communism. That's the way I like to put it. But, you know, the left always cites these examples of the Scandinavian paradise, right? Yeah. And we've debunked that myth many times on the show. So maybe we don't need to go into that too much. But what's the difference between socialism and communism?
Well, if you go back to Karl Marx, who really was the modern godfather of both systems, in his way of looking at things, he said, well, socialism is sort of a way station along the way to the end of history, which would be communism worldwide. And by his way of thinking, socialism would be characterized by a dictatorship of the proletariat, or the working class, as he put it, and it would involve ownership by government of the means of production, the abolition of private property. And then communism, he thought, would someday sort of magically appear as a utopia of share and share alike and everybody getting pretty much the same from the production of the economy. And at that point, under communism, he said that government itself would wither away. It wouldn't be one at all, which is really absurd. I mean, can you imagine people who accumulate such power under socialism to be in charge of almost every aspect of life, and at some point saying to everybody, well, we're out of here, we're just going to walk away from all this power that we have. He never explained how that was to happen, and of course it's a fanciful delusion from the word go.
So one of the things we hear from supporters of these ideas are, well, two things we hear from them, in addition to the Scandinavian myth that I mentioned, is, number one, the former Soviet Union and other communist countries were not Marxist. they didn't actually follow Marx's writings. And I kind of agree with that. If you read Das Kapital, which is, pretty complex stuff, but, Marx, they didn't really do what he said. It just became a big power grab. And communism, socialism, big government in any form is great for the insiders. The cognoscenti love it. I mean, who doesn't love power and wealth and money? And it's all, do what I say, not what I do, right? They're not living in a commune. So that's one thing. But the other element of it is that it's just generally never been done right. Like back to the Clintons, say, the criminals when they were in the White House, that always this idea was, well, I know it's been tried before, but they just did it wrong. We can do it better. We can do it right. Obama would have said that. And listen, I'm not giving the Republicans a pass either, because the Republicans are just modern Democrats. That's all. They're all big spenders. They're all big government. I'm not actually being partisan here when I say this, but the Democrats lean more in that direction. So
this is one of the many problems with socialists. They never own up to the outcomes of their own handiwork. Can you imagine if somebody said of the Hitler or Mussolini regimes that, well, that wasn't true fascism. Maybe we'll get it right the next time. In every case, what is attempted as socialism or full-blown communism does result in havoc and destruction and all the logical, predictable outcomes you would expect when you concentrate power. At some point, socialists have to ask themselves, maybe there's something wrong with the theory if we try it hundreds of different times with hundreds and thousands of different people, and it always ends up in disaster. At some point, they have to go back to the ivory tower theoretical concepts and recognize that they're flawed from the start. And all of these disasters were entirely predictable.
So you're saying they have done it right?
Well, they've carried socialism to its logical conclusions in each case. And what these socialists often say, was wrong was that, well, they shouldn't have used so much force. They shouldn't have bloodied up people. They shouldn't have confiscated all this stuff. Well, that's what people do when you give them massive power. Mm-hmm. Socialists do not yet recognize the eternal truth of what Lord Acton famously told us, and that is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what they need to do is jettison the theory and quit trying to make an unworkable delusion somehow work.
Okay, so when we look at this in a religious context, or really a historical context, it's not a religious context at all, actually, but we'll use a religious figure as an example, because a lot of people would say that this particular party was charitable, he was a redistributionist, he didn't like the money changers, and you know who I'm going to say? It's Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So wasn't he a socialist?
No, not at all. In fact, I don't think the terms socialist or even capitalist apply because, they didn't even exist for another 1,800 years after Jesus' crucifixion.
Right, but just because the word wasn't invented doesn't mean the concept didn't occur, right?
Well, that's right. But I try to steer clear of using those terms simply because it would tend then to define Jesus in a way that shortchanges who he was and what he really had to say. The question is, would Jesus have supported, or did he support, the ethics of a socialist system, such as forcible redistribution or central planning or government ownership of the means of production? There's nothing in any of his words in the entire New Testament that would suggest that he was endorsing any of those things. He was interested in what was going on in your heart. He never once advocated the use of political force or concentrated power to rob Peter and pay Paul. And he cautioned in his parables and in other teachings against the worship of wealth. You're right. You mentioned a moment ago that he drove the money changers from the temple, but, he never drove one from a bank or a marketplace. He drove them from God's house. It was an inappropriate venue for what they were doing. For the same reason, if you showed up at a funeral and with a kazoo and started playing Happy Days Are Here Again, there's good people who may love kazoos are going to ask you to leave.
Right. Okay, that's a good clarification on that. So was he, there's a difference between charity and government-forced redistribution of resources. So you would say that Jesus was charitable, right?
Oh, yes, and he encouraged charity. He encouraged people from their own resources and through their own free will to help others around them who may have needs. He told the parable of the Good Samaritan. The man who was walking along the road came upon another who was beaten and robbed. And what did the Good Samaritan do? He chose to help the man with his own resources and of his own free choice. If he had said to the man, oh, well, there must be a government program for you, or, hey, see you later, just contact your social worker, we would not know him today as the Good Samaritan. We would probably think of him as the good-for-nothing Samaritan.
Mm-hmm. So what can Scripture teach us about investing, about money, about business?
Well, first of all, I think the notion of magnifying wealth, of increasing the wealth of society, and doing it because that's the way you personally can get ahead, by serving others, producing things of value, is very much endorsed by the words of Jesus and the New Testament. In his parable of the talents, he tells the story of three men. Another man is leaving his estate for a time, and he entrusts these three men with a portion of his wealth. By the way, the initial distribution was not equal for the egalitarians in the audience.
Right.
And later the man comes back to find out what happened to the wealth that he entrusted these guys with. And as Jesus tells the story, the first man says, oh, I have no more than what you gave me. I kept it safe. I buried it in the backyard. Jesus ridicules him. He says, what? In so many words, he says, you didn't magnify it in any way? Well, that's terrible. The second guy says, oh, you'll be happy with me. I doubled or tripled it because I invested it. And he gets praise. And the third guy who says, I did even better than that, he gets the most praise from Jesus in this parable, who then goes on to say, I'm going to take the money from the first guy and give it to this third guy because he knows how to invest and how to be an entrepreneur.
So Scripture would want you to manage resources well and to increase them.
That's right. That's part of our calling, to be good stewards of creation. There's nothing in the words of Jesus that says he was interested in dividing up a shrinking pie. He was interested in baking a bigger one. I've heard people say, well, what about the loaves and the fishes when he fed 5,000 people? I was
just going to ask you that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, somehow that's sometimes thought of as a case for socialism. Well, as the Bible records, he turned to Philip, one of his disciples, and said, where are we going to buy the food that we need to feed these people? And the next verse actually says Jesus actually knew what he was going to do. He was just testing Philip. Well, then he did what he was going to do, which he didn't say to the disciples, there's a rich community nearby or a grocery store. Why don't you guys go raid those places and bring as much of the loot over here so we can feed this crowd? Instead, he used his...
So he wouldn't have endorsed setting up Chaz or Chop or whatever it's called. Well, no, I guess it's non-existent now. But yeah.
He used his own unique power to magnify wealth without pilfering a crumb from anybody.
Right. Talk to us a little bit about the Great Depression. You're a student of that. You say that there are some big myths that have come out of the Great Depression. And, I would have liked to talk to you about this 12 years ago during the Great Recession. But now we're in pretty strange times again. And, there's so much government and central bank intervention. And it's just sort of hard to know what's going to happen in terms of the overall picture. But I do know in some micro things exactly what's going to happen. And a lot of my predictions are already coming true. But yeah, what can we learn from the Great Depression? And what were some of the myths? By the way, I should mention, last night, interestingly, I just watched the Grapes of Wrath movie. So I just watched it last night. I just, I read that book in high school as part of English Lit, and it was interesting to watch it last night. So
I can see why you have the Great Depression on your mind.
Yep, I do.
Well, there are so many lessons to be learned from the experience of the 1920s and 30s. And they usually are just the opposite of what most kids are taught in high school these days. They're taught typically that, well, it was the free market or capitalism that failed us, the stock market that sunk us all and dragged the economy into depression, and then Franklin Roosevelt saved us with all of his various socialistic type interventions. Just the opposite is actually the case. The culprit in the start of the Depression was actually the Federal Reserve, just as it was the culprit in the start of the 2008-2009 recession. You had a period in the 20s of about 5 years of massive expansion of money and credit, dirt cheap interest rates, giving rise to the so-called roaring 20s. It was a bubble that was fostered by this easy money that the Fed was cranking out. And then in late 28, early 29, the Fed reversed itself, began jacking up interest rates. It did that dramatically for the next almost 3 years. And it pricked the balloon, and we collapsed into a recession first. But by the middle of 1930, months after the big stock crash in the fall of 29, we still didn't have a depression yet. We only had a recession with unemployment less than 9%. And the stock market had regained half of the ground it had lost since the collapse the previous fall. What took us from a recession into a depression in the middle of 1930 was the Smoot-Hawley tariff, in which President Herbert Hoover and the Republican Congress, with the support of some Democrats, raised tariffs to an all-time high and virtually closed the borders. It ignited a worldwide trade war. Prices plummeted, markets dried up. Farmers in particular were hurt because so much of what they produced was being sold overseas. And then 2 years later, Hoover, still in the White House before Franklin Roosevelt was elected, they doubled the income tax. They raised the top rate from 24 to 65% in one fell swoop, which took a depression and made it an even deeper one. Mm-hmm. And then Roosevelt came in March of 33 with his own bag of tricks, ending up prolonging the depression by another 7 years with all the interventions that he imposed, including hikes in taxes and destruction of crops and cattle and price controls on American industry.
Okay, so you're critical of Roosevelt, but was he really that bad? I mean, compared to today, his government programs, those were make work programs, or at least the gist of it. Yeah. And the key word there is work. For the past 60 years, maybe, or 50, we've been paying people to stay at home and do nothing but watch TV. I mean, yeah. It's pathetic what we've got now. So I don't know. Roosevelt looks like the guy that had the right idea to me. I mean, listen, if we're going to do, government handouts, let's at least build some highways or something, right?
Well, yeah, that's better than just paying people to do nothing most of the time. And so in that sense, yeah, you can say FDR wasn't, his programs weren't maybe as bad as some that we have today. But those programs were at best short-term lifelines for a lot of people, and they really didn't stimulate recovery from a depressed economy. In some respects, they actually, because of the spending and the higher taxes and the borrowing that they required, they actually prevented the kind of adjustment that could have ended the depression in a year or two. But he did a lot of direct harm, too. He actually, when he ran in 1932, he ran against Hoover for, among other things, raising taxes. But then once he got elected, he raised them even higher. And at one point, Roosevelt proposed a 100% income tax rate on all incomes over $25,000. And he imposed it by executive order until Congress rescinded it.
I mean, what could have possibly been that? I mean, so that was based on a tax schedule, obviously, right? Not everybody would pay 100% income tax.
No, and it was only on incomes over $25,000, which in today's dollars might be 10 times that. But he wanted every penny of what you earned over that amount. So
I guess how could you even float an argument like that? That's so absurd. What was his argument that, well, these people that are making over $25,000 a year already have so much money stashed away they can just live on that?
Yeah, he had for the better part of 3 full terms in office, he had a constant stream of invective aimed at wealthy people, even though he was one himself. So he appealed to the very left wing of his own party, which today wouldn't find that very radical at all. And I think, too, the really left wing socialist type of Democrat that FDR was appealing to at the time, they don't really care what the economic effect is of swiping as much as you can get from wealthy people. I think they'd be for it even if the government took the money and dumped it into the Pacific, because it's more appealing to them to punish somebody. They get excited about, wringing the necks of the rich people than they do actually helping others with the money they steal. That says something about their their core ethics and what's really going on in their heart, and the envy that I think has shaped their political mentality. It's a shame, but that's what Roosevelt was appealing to.
Sure. Well, as Obama said, you didn't build that.
Yeah, that's just another version of it. What did Obama ever build? Nothing. And yet he tells entrepreneurs who risk everything and endure all the hassles that come their way from government, and he tells them, you didn't build that.
Yeah.
Somebody else did. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, Lawrence, wrap it up for us with just any closing comments and give out your website.
Okay. I'll just say, Jason, that no society that has ever lost its character has kept its liberty. We didn't talk much about character today, but I think you would probably agree that it's pretty important stuff. And that's what concerns me these days more than anything else. When a people begin to lose their respect for the lives and property and the choices of others, when they expect government to do what they should be doing themselves, when they are no longer intellectually humble or patient or honest or courageous, they're putty in the hands of would-be tyrants. And that's the way so many places have lost their liberty.
Actually, let me throw one more in there for you that is just really disconcerting today. There seems to be a complete lack, well, two things. Where do I start? Number one, total lack of understanding of history.
Yes.
And number two, a complete lack of critical thinking skills.
Yes,
it is
absolutely
shocking to me how there's just no critical thinking skill anymore. I mean, you see it all the time on social media. It's really scary. But
well said. It's everywhere, and it'll be the death of the country if that doesn't turn around. So you can't expect government, which educates 90% of American K-12 children. You can't expect the government to teach either liberty or character. It never does, never has. So my website, for those who are interested, is Lawrence. That's spelled with a W, LAWRENCE. Middle initial W, last name Reed, R-E-E-D, LawrenceWReed.com, or you could visit our organization's website, FEE.org.
Excellent. Lawrence, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.